Zacanides. So thank you for coming. I also want to remind folks, if you have something that makes noise, go ahead and turn it off. There's also a list of talks that we're going to have this semester, quite a few, and today is our first one. I'll be happy to introduce you to Dr. Chavez in 2 seconds. Lastly, there's a quick reminder that after this presentation, there will be some time for some Q&A. However, we also invite you to join us at Nick's English Hut over on Kirkwood Avenue on the 2nd floor, where we can have more casual conversations and interactions with our guests. My partners and I, with the Colloquium Committee, Kimberly Watson, Olivia Phillips, and Dr. Pravina Shrekla, would like to thank also the staff, Kayla Jasper, Michelle Melhouse, and Tony Curie for all the work that they do behind the scenes to get this thing done. Come on. My partners and I would also like to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington is built on indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And I have to say this statement quite a bit, but to make it feel less performative, every time I do say it, I do donate $25 to $50 to our colleague, and I think he's a colleague, Renata Yazi, who is the founder and director of the American Indian Music Scholarship. She has recently passed over the QR code, so you are not required to do the same, but I invite you to think about it, and I will promise and dedicate that $25 to $50 to every time where I have to make that statement. Now, I am going to pass the microphone over to our colleague, Dr. Eduardo Herrera, to talk and introduce us to our guest speaker.
Thank you, Fernando, for the introduction to the introductor. Sometimes folks that are invited say, well, you can make the, just cut the bio, make it shorter. But this is such an interesting one, such a fascinating one that I'm just going to read it. Hopefully you don't get bored. You won't, because Dr. Xochitl Chavez is the first tenure-track Chicanx assistant professor in the Department of Music at the University of California, Riverside. She's a scholar of expressive culture and performance, specializing in indigenous communities from southern Mexico and transnational migration. Her current work focuses on second-generation Zapotec brass bands in Los Angeles, California, and transborder relationships with their communities of origin in Oaxaca, Mexico. Dr. Chavez's forthcoming manuscript is titled The Guelaguetza, Performative Crossroads Ethnicity and Greater Oaxaca, which today she described as Oaxaca, California, which I love. This book documents the lived and performative movement of how Oaxacan communities in Los Angeles and Santa Cruz reproduced the annual La Guelaguetza Festival, one of the most celebrated indigenous celebrations of communal dances and musical forms. Dr. Chavez's education journey led her to attend the University of Colorado Boulder for a BA, then the University of Texas Austin for an MA, and then the University of California Santa Cruz, where she earned a PhD in cultural anthropology with an emphasis in Latin American and Latino studies. She was the recipient of the University of California President's Postdoc Fellowship and a Smithsonian Institution Postdoc Fellowship in 2013-2014. She collaborated with the Smithsonian Institution in many projects. I'm just going to mention some, as digital curator and content specialist for the Smithsonian Latino Center live mobile broadcast series, doing community-oriented work, bringing live online transmissions of various cultural practices direct from the community members' homes in Colorado, in New Mexico, in California, and in Mexico City. These broadcast series are now archived at the Smithsonian Latino Center outreach on YouTube and in Google Arts and Culture platform. Dr. Chavez is grateful for her long-standing relationship and work as a cultural and linguistic presenter for the Smithsonian Folklife Festival from 2010 to 2016. It is truly a pleasure to have Dr. Chavez here with us. We've enjoyed her in conversation. She's talked with some faculty members, she's talked to students. We've roamed around, we've gone to restaurants, we've tasted the different weathers that Bloomington can show in 3 days. And now we finally let her go, but only after she tells us a little bit more about her research. So please let me help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Xochitl.
Un cordial y afectuoso saludos a todos presentes. Thank you all for your gracious invitation and to all of the energies, to the different committees that worked together and coordinated my visit. Thank you very much. I am grateful for this opportunity to speak in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology Colloquium series, so thank you very much. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge and thank the indigenous communities of Oaxaca, Mexico, and the migrant communities located in California for allowing me to live, learn, and collaborate with them since 2005. This work would not have been possible without the participation of various community-based bands and music educators located in Los Angeles and throughout Oaxaca, Mexico. There is an estimated 120,000 Oaxacan indigenous migrants currently settling and working in Los Angeles, California. With 50 years of perseverance and dedication, community leaders teach fellow paisanos, countrymen, and youth how to read and play music in backyard patios, as you can see here in this image. If you didn't notice, this is actually the part of the tuba. So this is some of the photography work that I do. But in terms of not only in backyard patios and driveways or even small rented spaces, the music played in these open-air concerts is not taught in the public school systems here in the United States, nor in the public school systems in Oaxaca. Rather, well-known musically inclined community members in autonomous migrant-led public spaces hence function as traditional bearers transmitting knowledge. Interestingly, the socio-musical transmission of Oaxacan philharmonic bands occurs similarly in Los Angeles as in Oaxaca. That is, in non-institutional education conditions. What I mean by that is they're independent of its location. The trained band conductor is needed to rehearse the ensemble. In these spaces, beginners are challenged with both learning to read sheet music and technically mastering their instrument. So according to my ethnographic fieldwork research, which includes the creation, and we'll get to that, of a registry of Oaxacan philharmonic bands that historically has 40 ensembles in California. Today, there are 25 active Zapotec community-based bands in the county alone. The continued persistence of indigenous philharmonic bands in California shows their resiliency despite the socio-cultural elements tied to musical traditions, such as practitioners' precarious migratory status, systematic discrimination, and the double layer of linguistic challenges, and their dedication to maintain their cultural identity. The issue in the literature is that public and academic discourses have erroneously presented a stereotype and image of indigenous Oaxacans, both in Mexico and in the US, as poorly, under-resourced, and powerless. With my work, I provide a new perspective in that I propose an alternative image of survival and adaptability that can only happen through artistic creativity, grit, intention, collaboration, and investments in cultural practices. Some of these practices include intergenerational pedagogy, deliberately linking to existing social practices, as many of you know, can be based off of fiestas, religion, and of course, music. Thus, I intervene in the broader discourse to insist that we balance a knowledge of what is power in a community, and how the survival and adaptive strategies can be observed via the pedagogical practices and the concept of placemaking, which can be understood as a collective memory and visioning in reimagining everyday urban spaces. I'm going to ask for an interactive moment. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. If not, maybe just soften your gaze. And if you will, listen to this recording and to think about the following concepts of place, survival, and intergenerational pedagogy. I'd like to ask you all, did your ears associate this sound with place, with survival, or pedagogy? What you heard is actually an audio called El Anuncio. It's the call. And this is one of 3 melodies that is played by a clarín, or a natural trumpet, that's traditionally played as a sonic announcement during religious fiestas in Zapotec communities. And this trumpet, this natural trumpet, are now some of the folks in California will play with the metal trumpet, is part of an indigenous ensemble called Chirimía. And this specific music can be traced back to the Baroque era through only transmission of oral transmission. And this was actually played just recently for Indigenous Peoples Day in Los Angeles because of a lot of political turmoil of what was going on this past fall with city councilmen. So this is where we saw Indigenous community members stand up and alongside, and we see collaborations with Black community members to call out forms of discrimination in their city. So today I'm going to show you what that music, Baroque era music, has in relation to my work, right? And we're going to look at this selection of music, right, and thinking about how it represents placemaking and what we're working on, and the term that Eduardo likes, right? My larger project focuses on transnational migration, and I employ the transborder and gendered lens to investigate the flows of cultural production among indigenous Oaxacan migrants, and how they are reproducing different cultural practices, such as dance and music and or various festivals across what anthropologist Michael Kearney coined Oaxaca, California. The term Oaxaca, California represents a cross-border public space where Zapotec and indigenous migrants have continuously transversed in search of employment and economic stability. So since the advent of the Bracero program in the 1940s and then again in the 1980s, indigenous communities in Oaxaca, of California, have created a vast infrastructure of networks across this region. And so what we're seeing is other reproductions of Zapotec cultural practices is the Guelaguetza festival, which I'll talk about at the end a bit more. It is also a space of social, civic, and cultural engagements where Oaxacan migrants actively shape, presenting together their lives in the US as well as their communities of origin. So the fame of Oaxacan bands, when I talk about in terms of my presentation and my work, I carry this out in terms of placemaking, a concept to facilitate these creative methods of music transmission and sustainability with the community bands, and looking at also how they navigate conflicts and challenges within Los Angeles. So due to the number of its ethnolinguistic expressions, Oaxaca is one of the most culturally diverse states in the Mexican Republic. As part of this placemaking process, paying attention, very close attention to geographic location and social opinions of specific communities is crucial because it reveals underlying layers of how musical expressions build resiliency despite the impact of forms of discrimination. And one of the things is what we're looking at, and I'll show you shortly, is where many of them have been located, have settled, are seen as many times undesirable, treated in lesser than ways. So this is something to think about in the conversation of xenophobic experiences that indigenous Mexican migrants have felt, and where it exacerbates further feelings of otherness and foreignness. So this analysis on Oaxacan community-based philharmonic bands and placemaking demonstrate how invisibilized community use transnational cultural practices as acts and processes of agency. So I employ Thomason and Lipstick's method of accompaniment, or as I have as well, and I talk about it as acompañamiento, in both of these practices. Well, one, thinking about accompaniment as participating with and augmenting a community of travelers on the road, and secondly, the way in which accompaniment functions as a practice, participating with others to create music. So since 2005, I've been allowed to accompany indigenous community leaders, not only in California, but to travel with them back to their home communities as part of community councils, all the way back to their specific villages. in these transnational moments with the community bands, each step of the way, I always make sure to reflect on my acompañamiento as a Chicana activist scholar, and also to think about what that means to be present with migrant communities returning home and how that is bearing witness to the ways that they navigate and negotiate access to space, resources on both sides of the border. The fame of Oaxacan brass bands emerges from the Mexican nation-building story. So this development of the first wind bands as we know them today goes back actually to the mid-1800s, when communities tried to imitate the military bands imported during the brief reign of Austrian Emperor Maximilian. So we have then followed by former Mexican presidents of Porfirio Diaz and Benito Juarez, who were both respectfully also from Oaxaca, different parts of the state, and they created this commissioning of more military bands within each village. And so we see this where the bands became part of like the civic organization, or known as the state bands, a state band for the state of Oaxaca. The popularity of these ensembles became evident in the 20th century after the Mexican Revolution in 1910, when local authorities everywhere formed wind bands with military musicians to play every Sunday at the main square kiosco or gazebo for public entertainment. The rise of these bands, particularly after the 1920s, with Mexico's new governing regime, was part of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Through their nationalist and cultural education program, it's part of what's called the mestizaje policy and these cultural missions, that music, dance, and fiestas were used to educate the people under a unified national identity. So, however, though, in these nation-building projects, indigenous communities were included as static historical figures of Mexico's past, not part of their contemporary citizenry. The state of Oaxaca has an extensive musical repertoire influenced by the 19th century European salon dance music genres such as waltzes, marches, and pasodobles. While each of these genres have a distinct origin in Oaxaca, they were adapted by the philharmonic band's instrumentation, and such that native composers used their musical forms to create new musical pieces influenced by local and indigenous styles. So what we see is where musicians from indigenous communities began to include their local genres and their repertoires, and they would include danzas, which are part of your ritual dance, sones and jarabes, as well as chilenas, and then later on we see danzones. Many of these musical genres have undergone at least 150 years of transculturation, whereby musical composers have created their own distinct sound that is a very specific meaning for each community. So Oaxacan composers and musicians are recognized for their significant contribution of compositions to danzón music, leading and forming parts of the most famous danzoneras throughout Mexico. Sometimes you could find photos of them wearing military uniforms or very snazzy suits, which I would have worn a sparkly jacket for this day. You can find them in dance halls and kiosks in different parts of the town, again, forming part of placemaking for indigenous musicians, being historically as well as in the present, you'll still see them. So just to hear a little bit of music, I'm going to play one of the most famous. This is called Danzón Mirega, which was written in 1932, and it's by the Oaxacan composer Amador Pérez Dimas, and this is what's considered one of your standards for Mexican danzón. I'm only going to give a little bit of a teaser there. So imagine yourself in Mexico City or in the center of Oaxaca City and dancing with community members. This particular, the danzonera could be found in a very famous dance hall called the California Dancing Club. And so actually Dimas was specifically commissioned to make this song for that dance hall, and he called it a danzón nireda to allude to the Mediterranean Sea, and in honor of that venue. And so niredas means the nymphs, right? The next one, to hear a more contemporary sound of Oaxaqueño compositions, is by the composer Pedro Hernández Vázquez, and this is a paso doble. And this is a musical piece that actually came out of a CD called Mujeres. It's a 2 CD where one side is all women's compositions and the other is an homenaje to some of the more traditional sounds. But on that CD, and as part of what I've shared earlier, is one of the works that I do is called collective songwriting, and the first song that's listed is the title track song, is one of that I helped facilitate with the collective songwriting. But this one is Chávez, and it is in honor of his son. And when we talk about a paso doble, it's a Spanish word for double step, and it's a fast Spanish military style march, where you would definitely hear in terms of many times at a bullfight. While it's a very powerful piece, as we heard at the very beginning, Maestro Pedro noted in a personal conversation with me that it also exudes an air of calmness, just as what he wanted to represent, like his son. And the song both have still many years of life ahead of them to continue to grow. Much of my research visits in the Sierra Norte, the northern Sierra region of Oaxaca, interlocutors ranged in the ages from their 60s to 95. And they shared with me that during the 1930s and 50s, community bands were supported mainly through communal donations by residents in the village in order to purchase new instruments. So being part of the village band is a highly respected role and also signifies participation in a civic duty, which actually exempts them as musicians from other communal cargo responsibilities. This is a communal practice that still happens today. One of those individuals that I was able to interview is Maestro Ismael. He is the one that is in the middle of the photo with his hand up, and he is surrounded by at least 20 of his former students. In this interview, he commented that community-based philharmonic bands thrived in Oaxaca until the 1980s. It was when the Mexican peso devaluation that happened in 1982 that caused a mass immigration wave of men from the Sierra villages to seek economic relief, thus leaving many communities without a band. It was in Maestro Ismael's words that a community without a band is a community without a soul. This expression warns fellow villagers and migrant musicians about the importance of the community-based bands and their vital roles in the process of placemaking. To heed the musical concern, a nearby Zapotec boarding school in the village of Xochitl implemented a specialized music program in 1984. This is where Maestro Ismael was hired as the first music instructor and taught for 25 years. It's called the Center for Social Integration. We could talk about boarding schools, indigenous boarding schools on another one, but even just the title, the Center for Social Integration, was where he taught with Zapotec community members, but he said he also learned various other indigenous languages because once that program was there, people from other communities were sending, at that time it was only a male school, now it's co-ed. So when we think about the sustainability of music traditions requires quite a bit of community effort. So under his tutelage, there were several generations of Zapotec musicians that became certified from this school and are now instructors either in Oaxaca, while many have immigrated to Los Angeles and formed reputable bands. And in this photo, we have actually Maestro Maqueos, who I work with quite a bit, and some of the other community members. This photo was taken on November 22nd for the patron saint celebration of Saint Cecilia. And so they brought together over 8 bands in a dance hall migrant-based dance hall, and it was just packed. So you have your religious aspect, and then you have your civic aspect of celebrating music, and everyone shared different pieces, and it was in honor to Maestro Ismael. When we think of Los Angeles, right, so I'm going to take you now here, and we think about, in some parts, there's still residential segregation. And this, by ethnicity, that predates the arrival of immigrant communities to LA. In fact, immigrants in search of intra-ethnic well-being continue to reproduce pre-existing settlement patterns through their use of social networks to find housing. The concentration of immigrants in specific neighborhoods is further exacerbated by the need for affordable housing, which is often only available when we think of communities that are deemed less desirable to live in. So for example, in the neighborhoods of Koreatown and Mid-City, which are the communities have been historically African-American and Korean, we've seen demographic shifts happen with Central Americans from Guatemala as well as El Salvador in this area, so then followed by indigenous Mexicans, specifically from the south of Oaxaca. So this legacy of negative attitudes and discrimination towards indigenous Oaxacans and their children is manifested as a result of colonial logic and present-day forms of racism at the hands of mestizo immigrants in the US, as well as Latino heritage and non-Mexican peoples. Indigenous immigration is unique not only because of the national borders that they're crossing, but when we think about legal, racial, ethnic, cultural, and regional borders. So to combat these various forms of discriminations and build a sense of community, in the 1980s, many of the migrants began to create what are called binational organizations, or in political science, hometown associations. And these are based all on shared identities as a response to ethno-racial discrimination. So when we think about, so what are these hometown associations doing, right? Why is this important for them to come together or even have bands? They were creating fundraisers because that money would go back to their home communities. And in order to have some sort of fundraiser, you need to have what elements? Food, some music, and time to celebrate together, right? Some dancing. So many of what was called kermeses, or these fundraisers, were held at churches or at parks, where they would also include rides and games, and as a way to bring community together. So when we're thinking continuing forth with this placemaking process, the earliest Oaxacan bands that actually started in the 1970s, and we see this largest concentration right in here with some of the bands, and here I do have the key or the legend to tell you what are the names of the bands and or their communities. This is just actually a portion. There are still bands that are down here towards Compton, as well as we get out further west of Los Angeles. But this is just a snippet of part of like where the main concentration is. So these bands, as I mentioned, were not only part of infrastructure, but it was also a way for their life cycle celebrations. So the two original bands were, and I'll point to them right here, was Yasachi El Bajo and Santa Maria Xóchitl. And they were the first generation of bands that formed. The next group were youth bands, and that was 2001, where we have the second generation by Banda Nueva Dinastía, which they are neighbors right in the Compton area, as well as San Andres Solaga, and these are part of, from the Northern Sierra. So in contrast to the first generation placemaking initiatives, second generation bands were created as a way not only to maintain traditions, but importantly, to think about what was happening in the late 1990s, early 2000s in Los Angeles. And that was a way to also detour them from any kind of vices or violence that was happening. Many of the musicians asserted that these bands actually also served as a way to be cathartic, a safe space for themselves to desahogarse, to vent, and as a way to talk about their experiences with other community members. So in my work with the bands, it documents not only the spatial distribution of rehearsals in Los Angeles, but what we're also seeing is migration patterns and the charting of where specific communities are locating. So this map of downtown Los Angeles illustrates the rehearsal location of the bands, and many, as I've indicated, on this particular neighborhoods, but these are also microzones. when we're thinking of where the Zapotec communities are residing. And so this is actually what's in there too, in addition to the rehearsal, but where this little green patch is right here, that is actually one of the most well-known parks, Normandy Park. And this is where Oaxacan basketball tournaments started, as well as the first Guelaguetza Festival of the United States, and that was in 1987. So for Oaxaqueños, LA, right, this particular area tends to be like the mecca, the center. But as we see, there is numerous other cities that they're part of. So I want to give you, again, just to reiterate why all the detail on spatial distribution. What we're seeing here is I brought the map of Oaxaca, and I know it might be difficult from the lighting, but I just want you to see in terms of the mountainous area and the difficulties, like there's not very many roads, but what is being reproduced here is in some way, you see almost an exact replication of the bands. Here's Xochitl Alto, Xochitl Bajo, and these dots, they are still in the same neighborhood. There's San Andres Solaga, and that orange up there is also San Andres Solaga. So this is something that I find of importance to see how there is this almost exact replication of their native regional placement in their new location of settlement. And so, as I said, as a result of this concentration of Oaxacan immigrants within Korean communities, there are now indigenous nonprofits, cultural organizations, alongside other Latino business coalitions that are working in Los Angeles to name this corridor Oaxacan Corridor. Of course, the naming of the space also signals demographic shifts in the area and raises questions of developments of multiracial neighborhoods and the relationship among other ethnic communities. So if you will, I've shown you a map, now I want to show you inside where this music practice is happening, right? So as we take a closer look, right, from those neighborhoods, those are very congested neighborhoods or areas for those that are familiar with Los Angeles. Finding an affordable rehearsal venue is, has to be conducive also to the size and the cacophony that can also be very difficult. So many musicians have stated that when they go to band practice, they run the risk of having the police called on them. And this is a situation that many cannot afford because of their precarious legal status. So unfortunately, there have been several incidents of clear aggression towards the Oaxacan bands, such as bricks being thrown at their windows and or homes, or police calling on them wherever they might be. But what we see is that bands are working their best to secure a stable rehearsal location. So several of the bands have made their own arrangements within their own homes, those who were able to buy homes, and they dug out basements and made their own form of vernacular architecture to create a space for weekly practice. We have Maqueos Academy, where through monthly donations, and as you can see, egg cartons are what were used and donated to make the soundproofing, and this was actually in a warehouse. So we see how everyone comes together to create a space, and then also one of the other bands, they converted a garage into a space where they put an air conditioner and did murals. So we're seeing, again, additional ways as to how they are carrying out these practices. So when we think about these moments of what's going on in these neighborhoods and how not only are they having to do it within their schools, but again, even on the streets, I want to share how the communities and the bands actually take up space and who were the individuals that are going to ask for the correct permits. This is actually a short video where I participated with, since I play the alto saxophone, and many times I oscillate between either helping, like as if I was a band parent, or doing my research, or hey, we need another saxophone, you got your mouthpiece on you or your sax on you, and so sometimes you get in there, you're voluntold. So this is one of the, this was a parade, this was one of the announcements before the Guelaguetza Festival. This is a 2-mile parade route, and this is right before we got to the Normandy Park. Pardon the shakiness, but it was one hand on the saxophone and one hand on the phone, okay? I was keeping it real. So what you probably got to see in a very fast motion was some of the architecture, the painting, to tell you what was the businesses that were on the wall. So populating these streets are brightly painted, indigenous-owned small businesses, interspersed between businesses with Asian architecture features. Some of the formerly Korean-owned businesses are now Oaxacan-owned businesses, donning contemporary murals, such as the very famous Guelaguetza restaurant that was bringing in Oaxacan artists. We also have other very striking murals and colors that tell the story of the community's visibility and what cultural anthropologist Maurice Magañas calls the multimodality of the archiving method, and where we can see how space is shaped and shared with its residents. I love this image of Maestra Jessica, because what we see now is the pedagogical styles, right, within those walls and spaces. We see collective organizing and teaching. So today, in nearly every single community band, what we see is a practice of called escoletas. That's their word to say community-based music schools, right? And these are sponsored through family donations, and many times still their communities of origin send their money to help them or whatever resources. So children are taught how to read and play music during evening and weekend hours. Previously, sheet music was obtained through international courier services or when someone would travel back and forth. Sheet music was primarily handwritten notation, but today, now, as youth are starting to get educated with music and access to computers, right, we're now seeing music being prepared off of various software programs. So it depends on which band you're with. You'll see, actually, people are versed on both styles. Moreover, the Spanish language educational booklets now that were created in the communities have been processed to make them into electronic files, and they're sent via WhatsApp and Google Drives, and they circulate among this specific network of indigenous musicians. This is something that I really want to bring into note is when we think about what are the languages that are being spoken within music classes, it's Zapotec, Spanish, and English. Right, so for the most part, these classes are linguistically, or as we would say, you know, within ethnomusicology, there's a bimusicality, as well as some would say bilingual, but as what my colleagues, a linguist, Claudia Olguin Mendoza, might call, this is called translanguaging, a stylistic practices, right? Because we're seeing music as well as language happening at that time. So when we're starting to get really into that type of scholarship of what's happening here, with music and how that's being incorporated. So participating in a community-based band prepares youth to participate in their patron saint celebration. And what happens is many of them want to travel back to their community of origin, because that also shows that culture does not flow one way, it's in a circular manner, or as the late social and cultural theorist Juan Flores describes as the circular pattern of cultural production. And it is where this Los Angeles youth are connecting their here, migrant life, to there, returning to Oaxaca as musicians, representing their communities in LA, for them as second generation, as third generation, and now even fourth, is a way for them to claim their pueblo's identity. To illustrate an oral example of placemaking in California, I'd like to take you to this march entitled La Sierra Juárez in Riverside. The Sierra region in Riverside, California. And this is a composition by Zapotec member Olivario Robles. And this was for the inaugural audition of the Oaxacan bands that was hosted at UCR in 2018. And the song was inspired, this marcha, because no university in the United States nor in Mexico had ever offered a space or an opportunity for Oaxacan indigenous brass bands to come together and play their traditional music in an academic setting and have a community focus. So according to indigenous traditions, at a specific point in this audition, all of the bands come together to play this march. And so I'm just going to play a snippet, because this was one of the first songs to very much mark this kind of trans-border experience and placemaking. Where's the sound of this? Unavailable. I will get it for you later. So with that, in terms of thinking about this composition, it united all of the 4 Los Angeles bands that I had actually invited to an outdoor stage in front of the UCR Performing Arts Building. And this was, the 2 bands were the first all-male bands and then the first 2 youth bands that were formed in Los Angeles. And to my surprise, many of the founding band members, who are now in their 60s and early 70s, returned to sit in the ranks with their 4th generation musicians to play together at one of the largest Zapotec community events on a university setting, where what we saw was a total of 140 indigenous Oaxacan musicians sonically and physically marking their place in the University of California system. So the adage that Maestro Ismael shared with me when I first began this work, a community without a band is a community without a soul, became a stark reality as the result of the global pandemic of COVID-19. We all experienced challenges related to the shelter-in-place regulation for nearly 2 years. And the Oaxacan community, specifically when we were thinking about those rehearsal locations, signified not only a place to play music, but these were community centers. These were spaces that provided reaffirming cultural activities. They were safe after-school settings for children who were awaiting their parents to come home from work. Unfortunately, due to the loss of jobs, families were no longer able to afford music lessons, let alone just to be outside. So what we're looking at in terms of collective tools for collective survival, right? These factors significantly impacted music instruction in regards to income, the ability to play at a rental space. So as educators, we all know the barriers that some students have faced in terms of technology and internet access. This was further exacerbated by Zoom and other platforms' inability to play multiple audio feeds simultaneously. So technology limitations, income, loss of interest, and the space, loss of space was too big of a blow that caused many of the bands to fold. So music and community-based bands, what they started to do, they're vital in marking life cycles in the Oaxacan community, and specifically the coronavirus hit very hard for the indigenous communities where their death toll was just exceptionally high. So customarily, the departed person would receive an all-night vigil and funeral ceremony, serenaded by their local band. Tragically, funeral rites and repatriation of the body back to Oaxaca, the departed body back to Oaxaca, became impossible due to geopolitical politics and rhetorics from the former President Trump and Mexican President López Obrador's administration, which reminded indigenous migrant communities of their non-belonging in both places. So in response to these limitations,